5,000 years ago, an entire farming community near what is now Paris simply vanished. Not gradually, not through slow decline. The people who had lived there for generations, who had buried their dead in the same massive stone tomb for centuries, disappeared almost completely and were replaced by a population that shared no genetic connection to them whatsoever. We know this now because of DNA, extracted directly from bones that had been sitting in the same tomb for 5 millennia. And the story it tells explains something archaeologists have wondered about for decades. Why across an entire continent, people simply stopped building the giant stone monuments that define this era of European history, seemingly all around the same time. The evidence comes from a large megalithic tomb near the town of Bari, roughly 50 kilometers north of Paris. Unlike most ancient burial sites, which typically preserve only a handful of individuals well enough to study, this particular tomb had been used continuously across 2 distinct periods, spanning roughly 3200 to 2450 BC, accumulating burials from generation after generation before the record breaks and resumes with an entirely different population. That gave researchers something rare: a large, genetically analyzable population, sampled from the exact same physical location, before and after whatever happened in between, rather than having to compare bones scattered across separate sites that might never have been directly connected in the first place. A team led by Frederik Valeur Seersholm, an assistant professor at the Globe Institute at the University of Copenhagen, sequenced the whole genomes of 132 individuals buried at the site. Their findings, published in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution, revealed something that went well beyond an ordinary generational shift. Seersholm described the result plainly: there's a clear genetic break between the 2 periods. The earlier population, buried in the tomb before the collapse, closely resembles other Stone Age farming communities already documented across northern France and Germany. The later population, buried in the same tomb after the collapse, shows strong genetic ties instead to southern France and the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. These aren't 2 branches of the same family tree, gradually blending together over generations through intermarriage or slow cultural assimilation. They're 2 entirely separate populations, with no meaningful genetic continuity between them, using the exact same sacred burial site centuries apart, as if the location itself carried enough significance to be reclaimed and reused by newcomers who had no ancestral connection to whoever built it in the first place. Somewhere around 3000 BC, something reduced the original population sharply enough that essentially none of their direct genetic descendants remained to keep using the tomb their own ancestors had built. Researchers describe this period as the Neolithic decline, a documented but poorly understood downturn already known from other archaeological evidence across the region. What ancient DNA now adds is a far sharper picture of just how total the resulting population turnover really was, at least at this specific site. Exactly what caused that collapse remains an active area of research. The most direct evidence in the DNA points toward a combination of factors, rather than one single cause, a general pattern of health and environmental stress consistent with the kind of gradual demographic crisis a farming community can suffer through poor harvests. Disease or some combination of both, rather than any single catastrophic event like an invasion or a single epidemic sweeping through all at once. Some researchers studying the same broad period have specifically raised the possibility that ancient strains of plague may have played a role, based on separate detections of the pathogen recovered from burials dated to a similar timeframe elsewhere in Europe. This particular study's central finding, however, is the population replacement itself, clearly documented through genetics, rather than a single confirmed cause behind exactly why the earlier population declined in the first place. Here's where the story connects to something much bigger than one tomb outside Paris. This population collapse happened right around the same time that a much larger, well-documented migration was already reshaping the rest of the continent. The expansion of Yamnaya pastoralist populations out of the Eurasian steppe. An event genetic studies have independently confirmed replaced large portions of Europe's population during this exact era, including regions as far away as the Cucuteni-Tripilia megasites of what is now Ukraine and Moldova, one of the largest urban societies of its own time, which similarly declined during the same broad window of continental upheaval. The new group that eventually resettled the Berry region, with its genetic ties to southern France and Iberia, likely reflects the same broader continental reshuffling, arriving from a different direction than the Yamnaya migration, but during the same turbulent centuries when Stone Age Europe was being fundamentally repopulated from multiple directions at once. There's a specific cultural mystery this research helps resolve. For years, archaeologists have known that the tradition of building massive megalithic monuments, the same broad tradition responsible for structures across Atlantic Europe, from single tombs like this one to eventually far more famous structures like Stonehenge, built centuries later by related traditions, ended abruptly across much of the continent around this same period. Nobody was entirely certain why an architectural and religious tradition that had persisted for well over 1,000 years, requiring enormous coordinated labor and shared cultural knowledge passed down across many generations, simply stopped roughly all at once, across an enormous geographic area stretching from the Iberian coast to Scandinavia. Seersholm's research offers a genuinely direct explanation. The tradition ended because the people who built it were gone. It wasn't that a surviving population gradually lost interest in massive stone construction, or shifted to some new cultural fashion. The community that had the specific knowledge, labor organization, and religious motivation to build these monuments in the first place appears to have simply ceased to exist as a continuous population, at least at this site, replaced by newcomers with no inherited connection to that specific building tradition. This finding fits into a broader pattern genetic archaeology keeps uncovering across this same general era. Stone Age Europe from roughly 3000 BC onward wasn't a story of slow, gradual cultural evolution passed smoothly from parents to children across the generations, the way history is sometimes casually imagined. It was, in multiple regions studied so far, a story of sharp demographic ruptures, old populations declining or vanishing entirely, and new populations arriving from elsewhere, quietly filling the resulting vacancy. Sometimes at the very same sacred sites the previous inhabitants had once built and maintained, inheriting the stones without inheriting a single drop of the blood of those who first raised them. The people who built and used this tomb near Berry for centuries left behind massive stones that still stand today, alongside the physical remains of 132 individuals who, until whole genome sequencing became possible, had no way of revealing that their community's story had two completely separate chapters, written by two unrelated peoples, sharing nothing but the same patch of ground and the same monument to bury their dead beneath. Visitors to the site today can still walk past those same stones without any way of knowing, just by looking, that the people resting beneath them aren't one continuous community at all, but two entirely different peoples, separated by a silence in the historical record that only genetics has finally learned how to read. The unwritten record, some of history's biggest stories were never written down at all. Subscribe and check out the rest of the channel.